Hi, everybody. Welcome to our session. You're in the Building a Linked Data Model for Archival Collections Related to Slavery, the On These Grounds project session. I'm Michelle Futornick. I'm a member of the Conference Program Committee from Stanford University, and I'm going to be our facilitator. I'll be introducing our speakers and facilitating our question and answer session. So we have 3 speakers, and each will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll do questions at the end. But feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box along the way, and then we'll cover them all at the end. And I'll also be monitoring the chat if you have any questions you need to put in the chat. On the slide that I'm sharing, just a couple logistical things. We have a conference code of conduct, which you can visit at the bit.ly link there, and that page will tell you all about the code of conduct and how to get help. Also, if you haven't already joined our Slack workspace, you can do that with the bit.ly link and continue discussions with your fellow attendees after the session. And we are recording this session and streaming it to YouTube. And now I would like to introduce our speakers. Our speakers today are members of the On These Grounds project team, and I'll introduce them in the order they'll be speaking. First is Sharon Leon. Sharon is the Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University, where she directs both the Omeka web publishing project and the On These Grounds project, which we'll be learning about today. And prior to her current position, she was Director of Public Projects at the Rosenzweig Center for New Media. And next is Emily Baldoni, the metadata librarian at Georgetown University, where she manages metadata for special collections materials and digital collections. And she has contributed to the development of the data model for the On These Grounds project and has participated in testing the model with archival materials from Georgetown's collection. And Sam Smith is a PhD student in history at Michigan State, where she works as a research assistant for the On These Grounds project. And before beginning her PhD studies, she worked as an archivist in Chicago. So I'll turn it over now to Sharon.
I remember to unmute myself. Thank you, Michelle, very much for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As Michelle noted, I have the great pleasure of being the director both of the Omeka software project and the On These Grounds project. On These Grounds has decided to use Omeka as the vehicle for which we're going to explore and develop our data model. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the coming moments. But first, some background on These Grounds. On These Grounds is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We're just beginning our 2nd year together. It is a collaborative team from Michigan State University, Georgetown University, and the University of Virginia, plus some of the Omeka team now doing some design and development work. And the sort of premise behind the project is that colleges and universities, institutions of higher education all over the country have over the last 20 years, but intensely over the last 5 or 6 years, been grappling with dealing with their history of involvement in enslavement and the use of enslaved labor. And lots of the evidence of that forced labor is present in libraries and archive special collections at these institutions. And so it seemed wise at this point to begin to think about how we might approach describing the lived experiences of enslaved people who labored in these conditions using a common model. And so we approached the Mellon Foundation for funding and decided to do that. And we were committed to doing it with linked data because we felt like it would allow us to most fully leverage the information that we have in these materials and describe not necessarily the materials, but the historical evidence that is present in them. And then, so the reason that we turned to Omeka S in particular to do this is because we do know that linked data is not an intensely simple proposition for most people in the world. And we had an opportunity with Omeka S to create an interface and a space of engagement for people who are not linked data experts to leverage the capacities of linked data. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just sort of introducing you generally to Omeka S and the kind of functional pieces of it. So I'm going to share my screen now. Omeka S is really the second generation of the Omeka web publishing platform. Many of you will be familiar with Omeka Classic, which came into the world in 2008 and has sort of been a mainstay of fairly simple publishing for libraries, museums, and archives in their collections, and also the capacity for extension beyond just collection publishing, but to include narrative exhibit building, geospatial work, a variety of other things. And, you know, Omeka Classic has hundreds of thousands of users, but there are some characteristics of Omeka Classic that make it not particularly useful for some of the things that we wanted to do. One of them is that the Dublin core metadata infrastructure is baked in to Omeka Classic. And we knew that that metadata schema was not going to be appropriate to describe the kinds of content that we wanted to describe. The other sort of key piece about Omeka Classic is that the metadata schema inputs for Classic are all plain text or HTML. And we really, you know, we're committed to the kind of power that data types allow us to leverage to link our material to the rest of the linked data universe and a variety of other things. So we went with Omeka S. Omeka S has been in the world since 2015, 2016. We're now at the 3.0 version. And not unlike Omeka Classic, it is extensible with a full set of modules and themes. It's open source software, and it runs on a regular plain old LAMP stack, which makes it a little bit easier for people to work with in the world. But its native data format is JSON. And the Omeka team built the API for Omeka S first, and then built the software using the API. And so there's been quite a good uptake of Omeka S in the world, in that there are lots of sites out in the world. I can show you a couple of them here. You'll see that they're very different, though they the commonalities you'll see amongst them is that they are collections of well-described items in collections sometimes, and exhibits and those sorts of things. So this is an African-American AIDS history project. Dan Royals and his team have put this together. This doesn't look like a very traditional Omeka Classic site, so you can tell that they have done a good deal in designing their own custom theme and those sorts of things. But they are pretty traditional library and special collections materials, and so sets of letters and images and things like that. Our friends at the University of Utah have used Omeka S in a variety of ways, but this is one of the sites that I think is sort of the most interesting. Historian at the University of Utah, Paul Reeves, has put together a team to collect and display information about the lives of, quote unquote, a century of Black Mormons. And so this is a situation where the material being described is in fact actually not special collections material, but actually individuals. And so we got to see people described in a very nice, concise way, with properties that are appropriate for describing people. The Indigenous Digital Archive has leveraged a whole bunch of IIIF plugins and extensions to bring together a nice big collection of material about Indian schools in New Mexico. Some of you may be familiar with the Journal of the Plague Year. One of the hallmarks of Omeka Classic sites have been for many years the ability to collect materials from the public. That is possible with Omeka S as well, and we're certainly not doing that in our work with On These Grounds. But one of the reasons I wanted to show you Journal of the Plague Year, which is a collecting project about the pandemic, is that it also leverages another feature that is different about Omeka S, and that is the capacity of Omeka S to include many separate sites. And so while Omeka Classic will let you only launch a single site, Omeka S will let you launch many sites out of the same installation. And so you start to see sort of rhymed themes and things like that. Omeka S has the capacity to host transcription projects and things like that. So there's kind of a wide array of materials. This Making the African Connections digital archive really contains much more traditional museum collections materials and those sorts of things. So Omeka S is, like Omeka Classic, extended by a set of modules that have been developed either by developers in the field or by the Omeka team themselves. And the way we can tell the difference between them, we're going to get a little bit further down in this list here, is the little Omeka logo will tell you that excuse me, module is designed, developed, and maintained by the Omeka team. And as we look through this list, we start to see some things that are really important to doing linked data work. Certainly a custom vocab model that will allow us to implement a local controlled vocabulary. Omeka S is designed to be embedded in the larger sort of scholarly communications ecosystem. And so it has connectors for institutional repositories for DSpace and Fedora. So there's the Fedora connector. It is possible to attach all sorts of different kinds of media to Omeka items. So developers external to the Omeka crew have also done an awful lot of good work to extend the capacity for it to work well with IIIF material and those sorts of things. So this group of modules is growing every day. In addition to the modules, there are a handful of themes that are produced and maintained by the Omeka team. And the one that I want to point out is the Foundations theme here. The Foundations theme is really designed as the base for other developers and designers to build upon to make something custom. For some reason, designers don't like to share their themes with us to share with other people. But we'd be happy to have them if you'd like to share them. So let me take a look at the administrative side of Omeka S and start to look at some of the things that would be interesting and useful for those of you who are looking to work with linked data. As I said, the core data type for the native data type for the model for Omeka S is JSON. The software itself comes with Bibbo, Dublin core type, and FOF preloaded as linked data vocabularies, but it is possible for you as a user to import any vocabulary that you would like out of the linked data universe. And what that will do is Omeka will make it possible for you to use the properties and the classes in those vocabularies to construct what are known as resource templates. And those resource templates really are the data entry form for someone who would like to describe a new item that they would like to put in an item set and attach media to. So if we go to the add an item screen, once it loads, we will select the template. And once that template loads, we start to see the properties themselves and some evidence of being able to constrain the data type. So this is the date is constrained here as a date stamp. We get a little bit further down in place here. I'm using the get a name authority file. So when I put East Lansing in, come on, here we go. East Lansing, MI. Come on. Maybe not. Usually it connects me to the, it auto suggests. Let me try again. Working? Maybe not. At any rate, what it will do for you eventually, if it suggests fast enough, that may be the slowness of my server, is it will pull the endpoint from the Getty repository, and that's also true of of subject headings. There's a whole array in the value suggest module. It's also possible to use other Omeka items as value endpoints. The Statue of Freedom is obviously not a contributor, but you'll see what I mean here, and those sorts of things. And so between those kinds of materials, we get to a spot where it's relatively easy for a user to build out a whole set of linked data connections and descriptors without actually knowing that they're building linked data, which is really pretty nice. And so then it gets possible. This is a sort of a junk site, testing site, to assemble those materials into a public site where users can explore them and can work with them. And here are, some special collections materials from the Histories of the National Mall site, which is kind of a nice example of some of the things that can be done on the front end. So we decided, given the fact that our users were unlikely to be able to write linked data by hand, that we would develop a model that we could use in a very, very simple, a simple interface for them to work with to move on to our next stage of testing. And so I'm going to hand it off to Emily to tell you about how the model got developed and how it works.
Great, thank you so much, Sharon. Give me 1 second while I share my screen here. All right, so I think you can all see my slides right now. So I think we're good. Great. All right. So in this next part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about the process that the On These Grounds project team has gone through to develop and test the data model that we're using here and that we are implementing with Omeka S as a platform. There we go. So as Sharon already touched on this a little bit, but just to give you a little bit of additional kind of background on the project. On These Grounds is a Mellon-funded project focused on building a shared descriptive approach for archival collections that are related to slavery at institutions of higher learning. And one of the primary goals of that project is to create a linked data model that facilitates the aggregation and reuse and exchange of that data. So the focus here from the outset was creating a model that would be capable of representing the experiences in the lives of enslaved people who labored at these institutions of higher learning. So while the OTG ontology is clearly, it's closely tied to the archival documents, it's the events that are depicted in those documents that are the primary object of representation for the model. So I think that in many ways is kind of in contrast to a lot of the existing descriptive models that are in use in libraries and archives, because those tend to focus on descriptions of documents, whether that's individual documents or groups of documents. So project partners at Michigan State, University of Virginia, and Georgetown began meeting regularly to work on the model around July and August of 2020. So at the outset, the focus was primarily on event modeling. We knew that we would also eventually need to be able to represent the people, organizations, and places that appear in these collections, of course. But the feeling was really that those types of entities were already relatively decently represented in existing linked data vocabularies. So where there was really a unique contribution to be made was in the representation of events occurring in the lives of enslaved people. So we looked at some existing event models like the event ontology and simple event model, but we really felt that kind of more general event models lacked the specificity that was needed to represent the subject matter to the degree of granularity that was needed. We did also look at the event model that is used by the Enslaved project, which is another digital humanities project trying to collect data related to the history of enslavement. But there were some structural incompatibilities between their approach and ours, which essentially meant that we couldn't just reuse their event model. So as the team started looking at how to model this type of data, we started with some basic work on domain description and scoping. In other words, trying to define what the universe is that we're trying to describe. So this included surveying archival collections at the partner institutions and identifying some key document types, trying to kind of settle on a core set of event types as well that we wanted to be able to describe, as well as a set of competency questions that could be used to evaluate whether the model was fulfilling the functions that it needed to. We also, I think, pretty close to the beginning of the project, we did an exercise where each team member brought a sample document from their institution's collections. For example, could be such as the baptismal register that you see on the right, which is from Georgetown's special collections. And we basically took those documents and we kind of workshopped them as a group, kind of marking them up and identifying the pieces of information that we wanted to be able to record. And this was really helpful in thinking about what kind of data we needed to capture and also some of the potential difficulties that could come up with that. We had as our starting point a set of event properties that had really come out of Sharon's previous research with the collections at Georgetown. And these really formed the basis for basically everything that followed. At that stage, those properties were organized into essentially two different versions of the model that we could then start to test. A simple model and a complex model. And I'll say more about the differences between those two versions in a few minutes here. But central to both of those initial versions of the model were a set of kind of core event types. Basically, these are 15 different categories that can be used to kind of usefully classify the different types of events related to the lives of enslaved people that we see depicted in these archival documents. So those event types are really at the heart of the model. And I do want to clarify that these are all intended within the scope of the model to be used kind of as they pertain to the lives of enslaved people. So for example, when we talk about an education event, we are talking about instances in the records where we have documentation of an enslaved person receiving instruction of some kind. Or when we talk about a life course event, we have in mind points where you have documentation of key events like birth, marriage, or death in the lives of enslaved people. And this top-level event typology has remained relatively stable throughout the different stages of development and testing, although there have been some changes in subcategories below them, some kind of slight reorganization. And then most of those 15 core event types also have subtypes. So these are the subcategories underneath the larger category. For example, within the religious event type, which we have a lot of those at Georgetown due to our history of connection with the Maryland province of Jesuits, within that religious event type, you have individual event subtypes, things like, for example, baptism, communion, confession, etc. And those subtypes allow for a greater deal of precision in the indexing of the events that are found in the documents. So, as I said, over the course of about 6 months, we tested two different versions of this model, what we called at the time a quote-unquote simple version and a complex version. Those are essentially two different but related ways of approaching this type of description. The simple model was, as the name would suggest, simpler. So it's slightly more stripped down. In the simple model, you basically had a single event class that was defined with a controlled vocabulary of event types, those same event types that we saw on the previous slides, which were used to specify what type of event was being described. And then along with that single class, you had a single set of properties that are the same for every event type. So some of those properties are pretty generic. They can be used with pretty much any kind of event within the model. Those properties include things like date of the event, the location, the name of the author of the primary source document that describes the event, and also the name of the enslaved person who is involved in the event. When that name is known, because of course there are many documents where the primary enslaved person is not actually named. However, even though all of the properties are available across all event types within that simple model, some of those properties only really make sense within the context of a particular event type. So for example, properties like symptom and treatment really only make sense or have meaning within the context of health events, where, for example, an enslaved person receives medical treatment for some kind of illness. Or similarly, buyer and seller make sense for certain types of commercial transactions, but not for, say, religious events. And in general, the simple model just had fewer specific properties. So it was intended to be more streamlined, but a little less granular in its descriptive capacity. In contrast, the second model that we started out with, the complex model, was more complex. So in that complex model, the event class has a number of subclasses which are used to specify the event type. So once again, certain properties are available to all event types. Those are the same kind of generic properties that we talked about in the previous slide. But the big difference is, in addition to those, you also had a whole set of customized properties for each event class. So properties like buyer or seller were defined for commercial transaction, but not for religious events. So on the level of the individual event type, you have more specific properties, and unlike the simple model, you don't have to wade through a list of properties that don't apply to the type of event you're describing and kind of wonder whether they're applicable, because that typology was more kind of baked into the structure. By October, we had these two slightly different versions of the model, and the next step was to test both of those versions and try applying them to some actual documents in our collections. So we selected a small universe of pilot documents from each of the institutions and then proceeded to try to describe those documents using both versions of the model. As we went through, we tried to use this experience to answer certain questions about the model. First of all, the properties. Are they too rigid, too constraining? Is the meaning of the properties clear to the person doing the description? Is there information that we want to be able to capture, but we can't with the current properties? And also a really big question, just was the workflow workable? Does it need to be streamlined? Throughout this testing phase, we were meeting basically every 2 weeks to discuss how it was going, but we were also trying to collect more structured feedback on the testing using a Google form, which you can see a small snippet of to the right here, which each of us would basically try to fill out following every testing session to start aggregating some feedback. So in this testing phase, there were two major methods of inputting the data that we wanted to try out using both versions of the model. Initially, we did most of our data entry testing through templates in Omeka S, which were set up to supply the allowed properties for each event type. Sharon's already talked a bit about Omeka as a platform, so I won't go into a ton of detail here, but one of the big advantages of this, of course, being that you don't necessarily need to deal with the coding on the back end in order to be entering the data because of the nature of the templates. The other method for data entry that we experimented with was CSV Import. So in this method, you could enter your event records into a Google or an Excel spreadsheet, then export a CSV file that could be used to import the event records in bulk into Omeka. And we felt it was really important to try to do some usability testing with the CSV entry format, because potentially that's a method that could be especially useful for entering data from records that have a lot of shared participants or a lot of events of the same type, say things like sacramental registers or inventories, that sort of thing. Potentially could be a much more efficient way of entering large sets of data. So we concluded round one testing in March of this year. Really the major goal of that first round of testing was to evaluate the simple versus the complex model and determine if one would be more feasible for adoption than the other. So as we evaluated the feedback from this round, we found there were some major trade-offs. So while the complex model offered kind of the fullest representation of the data in the documents, it was more difficult to use than the simple model. And this became really apparent when we started working more intensively with batch entry via CSV, because the complex model represented each event type as a different subclass with its own unique properties. And that meant that you needed a separate spreadsheet for each event type, which also meant you needed to upload each of those separate event type CSV files separately. That might not be a big deal for documents that contain just a single type of event, but for kind of more heterogeneous document formats, like diaries, correspondence, that sort of thing, the information isn't neatly separated for you. You have lots of different types of events occurring. And so you really lost a lot of the greater efficiency that the CSV batch entry format was supposed to give you. The other issue is just the question of how much some of those extra, more granular properties were being used. We found that Some of them that we thought we needed in the complex model were not actually getting used all that much, but it was making things more complex. So with all of those considerations in mind, we ultimately decided to adopt the simple model as the base of our alpha model with some modifications. There were some specialized properties from the complex model that we felt were just either too frequently used or just too important to leave out. Probably the biggest of those being the perpetrator property, which came originally from the violence event subclass in the complex model, used to kind of link an act of violence to the person who committed that act of violence. There's a feeling that that was just too important of a relationship to delegate to some kind of generic participants property. So there are a few different types of properties like that that we added to the simple model. There was also a little bit of, I guess you could say, rebranding that occurred. Calling it the simple model kind of makes it sound a little underdefined, and it's not actually that simple. So the name that it ended up taking was instead the single class event model, which is actually more descriptive of what it is anyway. This was also the stage at which templates and properties to represent other entities like persons, organizations, and places were built out more fully. Because as I said before, our work had been on kind of creating a robust framework for the events, but for the agents and places, we were kind of trying to borrow more from existing frameworks. But I wouldn't be surprised if this is an area that will get additional elaboration as we move into the next phase of development and testing. Speaking of which, I just want to wrap up by saying a few words about where we plan to go with this next. Because this is by no means a completed process. The team released the single class model in April 2021, but this should really be considered an alpha model. The set of documents that it's been tested on is still pretty small, coming from just a handful of institutions. So as a next step, we really need to expand the sphere of our testing. So related to that, one recent development, which we're very excited about, is that we have 5 new testing partners, which with the support from the Mellon Foundation are joining us in this next round of testing. Those are Hampton-Sydney, Rutgers, UNC Chapel Hill, University of Georgia, and Washington and Lee will all be participating in the next round of testing, and we are super thrilled about that. And looking forward to the greater geographic and institutional diversity represented by these teams to add much bigger variety to the types of events and documents that the model will be tested on. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Sam. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Sharon and Emily, for your lovely presentations, and thank you everyone who I can't see for tuning in live to this and potentially sharing out the recorded version with other people who could not be here. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the description practices of the on the grounds model so far and sort of how that relates to a lot of the conversations that Sharon and Emily have been having about linked data, and also in relation to the very diverse audience of listeners we have today. And in thinking about this, there's a lot that I could talk about. So I'm going to try to get as much in as I can and maybe not elaborate as much initially about it. And if you have additional questions about any one aspect, please feel free to ask a question about it in the Q&A. So one of the things, as you may have been gathering, is that description for these events, and also as they relate to the collection materials they come from, was very integrated. So it takes from archival description and DAC standards, live finding aids that have been done, as well as inventories that have been created for unprocessed materials you could work with to do this work. Relatedly, it deals and builds off of metadata standards that are a part of all of our practices. And in thinking about how we are doing event-centered description and really bringing out the event experience and lived experience of enslaved people and formerly enslaved people who labored at colleges and universities, there is also a lot of narrative description that can happen that may be more in line with the kind that might be done by historians or researchers, or even genealogists who may come in and encounter these materials in other ways at the reference desk or through digital collection portals. So there's really rich opportunities in many ways for this to happen. And I think another thing that I also want to emphasize is that in our initial core team and first phase of testing, and it's true of the second wave of testing as well, all of the people who represent various organizations and work with various collections at different institutions come from different backgrounds. So Emily is a metadata librarian at Georgetown, and she did testing. One of the people who did testing for UVA is a processing project archivist, and I did testing as well, handling the New Jersey documents that I actually never saw in person as a PhD student in history. So testing was done in various ways by people who have different positions and also a wide skill set. And I think that's important too, and part of the richness of this work. And so I just want to emphasize that throughout, a lot of different people have been collaborating together. And I think that's been really important to our process and being able to have it be, up to this point, successful how it is as a linked data model, but also in terms of descriptive practice. And I think a part of this is also how, and I don't know if you were able to see a little bit of that with some of the stuff that was shared, but there's a description field for each item in Omeka. And in that field, for a lot of the events we have been describing that relate to specific collection materials, is where we've also been including transcriptions that have been done. And I think an important thing in thinking about description as it relates to this model is how transcription is in a way a linked data itself. Was that done already? And is that in your institution? Is that available online? Or do you need to do that within this workflow? And do you want to do that? I think all of that is valid. And so I've been thinking a lot about how transcription, in a way, especially in our workflow for this project, was very much a linked data practice in many ways. One thing I'd also want to highlight in terms of the audience that's very diverse today is sort of how we are, in a way, very much taking from the cataloging idea of describing the aboutness of an item, just in a very more intense way. So it is about what's happening in a particular item and thinking about an event, about being not only the item itself, but who is involved in that and who is reflected in that, the creator as well as anyone who's mentioned. And a lot of the work of doing that is then triangulating that one record with other records in your larger collection. And so the aboutness that we're sort of dealing with in this description is very large and at many levels, even when we're talking about one event, like the sale of one enslaved person at a college or university. One thing that I do want to highlight also is how this work in total really shows the archival depth and the historic depth of the history of enslavement at colleges and universities. This came out for me this week when we had launch meetings with our testing partners, and a question someone posed to me in a breakout room was, are we considering the history of enslavement with the antebellum period primarily? And reflecting on my data testing and also the creation of items I did, I think a huge benefit of this work archivally and also with linked data, mostly because of linked data, shows that the history of enslavement is most certainly not just that. And the items themselves and the collections show that. It expands beyond that era in both directions. And I think that is very important. Another thing I wanted to mention, which I've sort of talked about, is how throughout all this description, there's been an intention to center the lives of formerly enslaved and enslaved persons who labored at colleges and universities. So in doing that work, we came up with a list of ethical commitments for what we're doing. And so all of our description comes from that place. And I can share that link to that. I'll put that in the chat for you all to have access to. And one of those being, you can see in Sharon, Emily, and me, we are a predominantly white group of women. And so acknowledging our positionality in relation to the work we do has also been hugely important. And with that, in this description, and also the creation of items and creating a linked data model of this size and also sort of an interwoven way, we are dealing at various levels at various times with vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. And that has actually been something that one of our other core team members, Brenda Gunn at the University of Virginia, has really spearheaded with us in thinking about. And I want to mention that because that is important, and I think important to the description and linked data work that this project does that may not exist in another kind. And so I just want to highlight that. And then a little bit about my own testing experience. So reflecting on how linked data was a part of the first round of testing for me was actually, I feel like in every level, because I was the person who did data testing for the Rutgers, who's now a testing partner, which is very exciting, and Princeton records in New Jersey. And so I, especially in the pandemic, did not have access. I've never seen these materials in person. I relied on digital collection portals and all the work of metadata librarians and archivists before me who I have never met to help me do my data testing. And so there's a part of the item when you create it where you can link to sources to help people find the catalog record, digital versions, et cetera, et cetera. I felt like I kept adding them for each item, and that is important. And so I think in every way of at least my workflow, and everyone's is different, linked data is a part of that. And linked data for me and how I did testing for this project very much made that possible. And so I also want to just mention that. And also as a result that I think it's very great that Rutgers, who we did use as a pilot in data testing, is now a partner. So I'm happy to elaborate on anything in the Q&A if you would like, but I will leave it there. And so thank you everyone for tuning in, and I look forward to the questions you all have.
Thank you, Sharon, Emily, and Sam, for teaching us about this important project to reveal the lives of people. And I really am struck by how it ties into some themes we've already seen in the conference. There was a discussion on Slack about the idea of being complete versus being practical, and the tension between those. I see that. And also, Sam, as you were pointing out, the human element of the data. So I really appreciate those tie-ins. And we have some questions now. So the first one is about the enslaved.org model. And you mentioned that you looked at using that model, but it didn't work for what you wanted to do. And could you go into more about why that was an incompatible model?
I can start to answer that question, but I bet you Emily has interesting and different perspectives on this. So I'm also an advisor for the Enslaved Project, because the Enslaved Project is at MSU, and so I meet with them regularly and those sorts of things. Because that is a project to aggregate data from existing data sets about the global slave trade. It is a people first model. And so the events are related to the people, but they're a little bit secondary. And their method for linking multiple occurrences of the same person is to do it computationally. There's a high likelihood that this person is the same as this other person. In our case, we were sure that we were going to have individuals who were going to appear in lots of different events. And so it seemed better to capture those individual moments in time as the primary entity. and then tie them to a disambiguated individual person. That being said, the models for enslaved, for the people, places, and organizations, lots of the models that are not the event type that we've developed, we've borrowed from enslaved, and we're eager to, this material will end up in their repository, we hope, and so they're incompatible is probably not right. It's sort of an alternate approach. So, Emily, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just I agree with everything that that Sharon just said, and I think to me the main issue with this sort of contrast of their model being a little bit more people-centered, whereas ours was concentrated on the events. So the big kind of consequence of that being, as Sharon touched on, in these instances where we wanted to have a disambiguated person entity that could be tied to different events, but we also needed to be able to, say, capture information related to that person that might change over time in different documents and different events that they appeared in. In some cases you have indications of their age or their enslaved status might change. So there's a variety of things that it was more. We felt that a different approach would be easier in order to capture those kind of different data points over time, because it's the same person, but the properties attached to them are not staying the same.
And as a follow-up to that, would there be a way to tie together the data from the two projects based on some other commonalities like geography or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's our eventual hope, and that's part of the question, some answer to some of the other questions that are in the queue here, is that because the end goal, once the model gets solidified, is for as many colleges and universities as possible to use it and to publish 5-star linked open data, so that all of those things can actively be integrated. And I know for a fact that we see individuals moving between campuses, between institutions, and it's likely that they will also show up in other kinds of data sets based on location, sort of civil data sets, court records, those kinds of things that other historians have developed.
And we have a couple of questions about the testing. One is, could you dive more into how you formed the partnerships with other universities to test the event model? And then do you think that Omeka S is a user-friendly platform for having different backgrounds of people doing the testing?
That seems like a great question for Sam. Both of them, actually.
Yeah, so I really like the one about is Omeka S more of a user-friendly and crowdsourcing platform? In a way, I think so. I think the fact that we had so many people who are engaged in a variety of workflows in their job be able to come together and, in part of their work, use this and develop standards of practice and create an ontology, I think that speaks well for the platform. I think to do that kind of work and the kind of work that we are doing, you need a good platform and one that you can develop as you go and add to. And Omeka S does that. I think that also shows in the people who have worked with Classic. There was so much work, and there still is a lot of work being done in Classic. And so I think the ease of Omeka is something that a lot of people know. I'm also curious, one thing that this question made me think about is something that I know a lot of us are sort of excited to see with the second round of testing. And that is how it works with students who are working on this to help at institutions, be those graduate students or undergraduates. And so I'm really curious for them, depending on where they're at, as well as with the kind of collections they're dealing with, how Omeka S works for them. And I think that will also be important feedback, especially in thinking about workflow at the institutions who use Omeka. And the other question was about the partnerships with other universities. And so I know that after we did some of our first round of testing we had reached out to Rutgers and Princeton to thank them for their collections and the work that they have done. And through that conversation, I know that Rutgers applied, and I think it's going to be a very rich opportunity for them because of how the Scarlet and Black Project is positioned within not only the library, but the university and various colleges. And they're also transitioning to a new location on campus. So it's sort of a good time to reevaluate where they're at in their work too. And I know that some of the other testing partners have also reached out to us because they're aware of the work we're doing. A lot of the universities are also involved in universities studying slavery. And so there are larger connections that a lot of the institutions have. And I think the interesting thing that's important to note with the testing partners is that some of them are in the Deep South. There's also a lot in the Mid-Atlantic, and then there's Rutgers in the North. So there's a variety of records and also conditions of enslavement at colleges and universities that this will highlight. So I hope that's...
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is we had an open call.
Right, and we did have that too. Yes.
For testing partners, and so we asked for a brief application, and there's some support to support the testing, and so asking people to describe their collections and their process with reparative description, and those kinds of things. So that's how we ended up with the 5 we ended up with.
And there's a question about relationships beyond the institutions with the records. How are your projects working with descendant organizations like GU 272 in the development of funding applications and project delivery?
That's a great question. And I would say at this point, each of the universities is involved in that work, but in the developing of the model, not so much yet. And I think that the stage for that kind of engagement will come when we actually have reviewed data to publish. But our hope is that the material that comes out of the work can be packaged and delivered in a user-friendly way that will allow descendants to really, at as finely grained a level as we can, to trace some of the genealogical things that they're interested in, to have a sense of also of the macro view of what the conditions of this particular kind of enslavement was and were.
Thanks, Sharon. Juliet Hardesty remarks that I'm really struck by the way this event modeling is still describing the events from a white-centered enslaver view. The event is buying or selling, not separation or kidnapping, or the view of the event from the enslaved person's point of view. How is your model going to move beyond the perspective expressed in the source documents to actually representing the enslaved person's experience?
Yeah, it's a spectacular question, and it's absolutely right. We have, in some cases, we have used buying and selling to represent a whole range of commercial transactions that may not be of human beings. And so we've made that decision for now. But that's the reason that this is the alpha model. And that's the reason that this is sort of the ongoing conversation and testing in the next year. The resistance categories are much more an effort, are titled in a way that suggests a lot more attention to the direct experience of the enslaved. And so it is this sort of balancing of, as the questioner suggests, the perspective of the record creator and the person's lived experience being described. And so I think that there's a high chance that those event types will change in the course of the testing. And we're absolutely open to that. This notion that we pretty quickly went from enslaved status to freedom status. And those kinds of things are all open for adjustment. And we hope that we will And that's part of the reason for having the wider testing group and a set of consultants and advisors, and to sort of catch those things. And the question is, does that mean that we have to separate the material commerce events from the violence of the transactions around human beings? And I think, there's a high chance that we should do that. Emily, you want to say anything more about that as we thought about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just I totally I want to just plus one to the like, these are still evolving, the terminology and the structure of the categories being used. And I was just, as you were speaking, Sharon, thinking about, there have been several cases already where we've changed the terminology that's used to do, to attempt at least to kind of move from that perspective of the enslaver to the perspective of the enslaved individual. And yeah, particularly in terms of the kind of some of the events in the resistance category. So I think that there's absolutely room for a lot more development on that. And I also think it's something we have to work hard to kind of work against in some ways, because also these documents are almost entirely written from the perspective of the enslavers. And that is, that's a difficulty of the material as well.
Yeah. Sam, did you want to add anything?
I would just echo what Sharon and Emily have said, in that this work is not done and it's still ongoing. So I'm thinking of when we came up with and we worked a long time on them, our ethical commitments, and I will drop that in the chat, that our last one is acknowledging that. And I think also that it's a collective effort. And I know that that's why we're very excited for this next round of testing. And, yes, it is a problem, and it's a problem of these documents. And so how do you acknowledge another view and bring that experience out? I think the promise of thinking about these collections and the histories they hold is that when thinking of events, there's a different perspective in shaping our understanding of them that potentially offers more room. So.
Thanks to all of you. The next question is about the structure of how the project is funded. How much was the initial grant from Mellon, and what's the overall budget of the project?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we need to be transparent about those kinds of things, because it's a little bit unclear what kinds of resources are necessary for this work. So there are the three core partners, which are, well, 3.5, which are Michigan State, Georgetown, and UVA. Then the 5 testing partners, and a little bit of slice of money for the Omeka team is developing a theme and an aggregation module. And so the overall budget funded by the Mellon Foundation was $550,000 over 2.5 years. And so you think about that, basically half of that, almost let's say 5/8 of that, is split between the core project partners to fund staffing over those 2.5 years. And then there are stipends to the testing partners, which we originally thought were going to be $10,000 a piece, but are closer to $15,000 a piece. And then a little bit of development money to the Omeka team.
Thank you, and thanks, Sam, for sharing that link to the ethical commitments. I know I would love to hear more about that. Were you able to develop that as part of the grant project? Was that foreseen as that would be a first step?
That's a great question. Actually, we were really clear because we wrote the principles from Georgetown and UVA, and I wrote the grant together, we had come to sort of a common understanding of what our goals were and what our commitments were. But we got to the point where we were getting ready to publish the alpha model and decided that we needed to like sit down and fully articulate those things for other people out in the world to be engaged with. Because it just seems like those things are not a given. In as much as we would like to hope, they're not, and so we needed to be specific and transparent about what we are trying to do, not necessarily that in any way, shape, or form that we have accomplished these goals, but these are the things we're trying to uphold with this project.
Great, so we can look forward to being able to see the data through the Omeka interface. You said a theme and is being developed?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah, and actually, let me, where are we? We have some test sample items that are available on the On These Grounds site, just so you can see sort of what the material looks like in action. Let's put that in there. So these are some testing items that the groups at UVA and Georgetown developed based on their documents. So in fact, so that the testing partners would have some samples to look at. So they're mostly people and events, not so much organizations and places, right, Emily?
I'm sorry for the slight interruption here. Yes, that's correct. Sorry.
Thank you for giving us that sample, and we're at the end of our time. So I really want to thank our presenters, Sharon, Emily, and Sam, for introducing us to the project and everything that goes into it. And thank you for everyone who was here for your thought-provoking questions. And be sure to go over to Slack if you want to continue the discussion there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.